I wish we had 2 hours. Thank you for being here.
I'm sort of glad we don't, Senator, but that's okay.
I can understand that. I just want to highlight a couple of things. First of all, thank you guys for addressing the debt. It's the dirtiest four-letter word in our English language today, and it threatens our republic. And you and I have had private conversations about that. In the last 16 years, under one Republican president, one Democratic president, this federal government has grown in constant dollars from $2.4 trillion to $3.9 trillion. And I know it's a philosophical debate up here between parties about big government, but let's just look at results. You talked about results earlier, so I made some notes here. Big government has failed. It's failed in poverty. In 1964 or 5, the Great Society put the war on poverty. We all were all for that. We wanted poverty reduced in America, but the irony is that the poverty rate today is basically the same as it was in the 60s when that great program was put into place. If you think the government does a great job running businesses, how about the U.S. Postal Service, the VA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac? And then we get to Social Security and Medicare. I want to come back to that in a minute. They both go to zero. Their trust funds go to zero in 15 short years or less. And we're sitting in the weakest recovery in 70 years. I want to get to the point of this exercise that we're doing today and call out what a travesty it is relative to the bigger issue. In the last 8 years, as a federal government, we borrowed about 35% of what we spend. And right now, in the 16 budget that goes through 2027, it was projected, CBO projected that we'd borrow another 30% per year on average over that period of time. Well, by definition, if discretionary spending is directionally $1 trillion on a $4 trillion budget, we're spending less than 30% on discretionary. The rest of it is mandatory. That means, by definition, if every dollar of revenue, by the way, we collected more tax dollars last year and the year before that too than we ever have in our history. And yet, we still have this growing debt problem. So by definition, every dollar we spend, every dollar we're debating here today is borrowed money, by definition. So I want America to understand what this travesty is all about up here. The travesty is that we're not talking about $4 trillion of expenditures of the federal government. That's what we're going to spend next year. And it'll grow from there. So what I want to get at here is the fact that the budget process itself is absolutely broken. It's only worked 4 times since 1974 in 43 years. And as a matter of fact, we have to appropriate this budget. You talk about authorizing. I mean, we haven't authorized things up here. We have $310 billion, some 250 programs that are not authorized today, to your earlier point. And that's not even being considered today. As a matter of fact, over the last 43 years, we've averaged 2.5 appropriation bills being passed on average during that period of time. We have to pass 12 to fund the federal government. That means that we're headed for a train wreck again this year. We'll go to September 30th. We will not have the government funded. We'll either do a continuing resolution or we'll have to do an omnibus where 6 people get in a room and the rest of us get an up or down vote about how we spend $1 trillion. And even that doesn't address the $3 trillion of mandatory expenditures. Now, I'm not arguing programs, I'm not arguing cuts. We'll do that at a later point in time. But I have to say this, I applaud the administration for at least addressing the issue that we've got to address over the next 5 years or so, and that is the long-term implication of debt. The specific question I have is, would you support a budget process eventually that would include all expenditures of the federal government?
Senator, I did. Yes. In fact, I had part of that discussion with Senator Enzi. Believe it or not, in the antechamber before we came into this room, I think it's something that we should start discussing.
Well, as we know, to get at debt, we're not going to do it by working on the $1 trillion.
No, you can't. You cannot balance the budget within the non-defense discretionary portion of the budget at all. You simply cannot do it.
Now, let's talk about growth for a second. And thank you for telling the American people that 1.9 is not acceptable. Let's dial into the 1.9. In the last 8 years, true growth here is 0.6%. That's without population growth. 0.6%. That's productivity. That's the way business guys look at it, because I can manipulate population. I can't manipulate productivity growth. Productivity growth is 0.6%. You want to grow 3%, there are 2 things we've really got to do, in my opinion, just as a business guy. But you've got to work on the workforce. There are plenty of people right now on the margins of our workforce that are not included in this workforce. I understand the low unemployment number, Director, but I'm concerned about the people that are underemployed. I'm concerned about the people who have dropped out of the workforce. I'm concerned about having matching skills with jobs that are available. That's number one. That's the first constraint on getting to 3% growth. Second is capital. You've mentioned it earlier, but we've got $6 trillion of capital. And this is a mistake that politicians make. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, but this is important. Politicians think that you want to stimulate 3% growth, we need more capital investment from the federal government. That's the last thing we need, frankly. I believe that right now we need to do whatever we can to free up the $6 trillion that are not at work in this economy. $2 trillion on the Russell 1000 balance sheets because of government policy, not just in the last 8 years, possibly over the last 20 years. The second is our banks, small banks and regional banks have about $2 trillion on their balance sheets because we've taken that capital reserve from 3% to 6% to 7.5%, unilaterally, by the way, in the Basel III agreement, where none of the other countries are really doing the same thing. And lastly, the repatriation tax has $2 trillion or more stuffed overseas. So my question finally is, to you quickly, is are those things that you're going to focus on, not just in this budget, but over the next few years to try to continue to develop a consistent 3% growth in this
Yeah, and I
economy?
think you, Senator, I think you heard that in part of my exchange with Mr. Warner, is that you must have more capital investment to get the productivity
But is
up.
that capital from the federal government more productive or from the private sector?
And that's the point, and what this budget does is try to focus on private capital
Thank you.
investment and not public.
Thank you.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.